Hey guys, so welcome to the second video for chapter 15. In this chapter we're going to look at genotype and phenotype and how the two are related. Okay, let's jump into it. Alright, it's probably very important to define what each one is. Your genotype is your genes. Your genes are the genetic component of the individual, whereas your phenotype is the expression of that gene. Yeah, so your genes might have a code for something, but that actual trait itself is called the phenotype, and that expression of the genetic makeup is the visible or the measurable characteristic that we can observe and see within the individual. Yeah, you can't see, you can't see what the gene does, but you can see what trait it results in. Okay, so if we were to look at an example with cystic fibrosis, right? Our genotype is the actual letters, the genetic component themselves. That particular gene that determines that CFTR protein is called the genotype. And you can see here there are a few different genotypes of this particular trait. Capital C, lowercase c, and lowercase c, lowercase c. So both your alleles, the combination of them, forms the possible genotypes for cystic fibrosis. Okay? The phenotypes of cystic fibrosis, there are only two. You can either have normal CFTR protein, which means no cystic fibrosis, or you can have non-functional CFTR protein, which results in cystic fibrosis. So you can see there the difference between the two. There are three genotypes for this particular trait, but there are only two phenotypes. Only two of them are actually being expressed. The reason, because the heterozygous type here, this kind of mixture of capital C, lowercase c, still results in a normal CFTR protein. Okay, snapdragons, you can see here the genotype now has three different genotypes for the snapdragon flower, but the phenotype also has three, yeah, because it is incomplete dominance. Yeah, red, pink, and white being the three traits that are actually being expressed. Blood type, once again, genotype, all the possible combinations. Notice how capital IA, and capital IA, lowercase I are two different genotypes, yeah, because the genes themselves are actually slightly different between the two, but they result in the same phenotype, which is blood type A or antigen A on the red blood cells. Okay, same can be said for B, AB, and then O. So here, how many genotypes do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. However, the number of phenotypes we have is 1, blood type A, 2, blood type B, 3, blood type AB, and 4, blood type O. Yeah? In other words, 6 genotypes resulting in 4 phenotypes for this particular trait. Now, the relationship here is really important. So, understanding genotypes, the genetic makeup, there are a few different combinations you can have. If both the alleles are the same, we call that a homozygous genotype. Yeah? If it is different, then it is called heterozygous, right? And so here's cystic fibrosis. If the trait is a complete dominance, the heterozygous can also be referred to as a carrier. So here's our example, right? Let me go back. Carriers do not express the trait, but they carry it. In other words, it sits within their genes and can be passed on to their offspring, but they themselves do not have that particular trait, right? Here is your homozygous dominant trait, capital C, capital C. Here is your homozygous recessive trait, lowercase c, lowercase c. They are homozygous because they're both the same. Yeah. This one is homozygous dominant because they're both the same and they're both a dominant allele. This one here is a recessive because they are both they're both the same and they are recessive alleles. This is the heterozygous, and in this particular case, cystic fibrosis is a complete dominance trait. Therefore, it is both a heterozygous trait and a carrier trait. It is carried into the next generation and is not expressed. Okay. The actual trait itself is the phenotype. Examples include fruit color, shape, and seed count, and all those things. You know, that's the actual resulting shape. Things like leg length in sheep is a genetic trait. Color blindness in people is a phenotype. Phenotypes are a bit more complex because they're not only in physical characteristics, they can also be developmental and behavioral. Okay, if you do chemistry, you might recognize this. You may not, but this is the biological molecule serotonin. Now, serotonin is used as a bit of a feel-good, right? Your body actually releases serotonin when you work really hard, you go to the gym, you do a bit of exercise, all these kind of things. And what it does is serotonin, your brain flushes itself with this serotonin, and it makes you feel like you've accomplished something as a bit of a reward system, making you want to repeat the behavior to gain the reward, that feel-good kind of thing. Some drugs will induce serotonin, which is why drugs can feel good at the time, but then it also creates all those kind of complications around the brain as well. Now, one of the things is serotonin is also known to reduce aggression in mice as well. So mice, different mice are born with different levels of serotonin, and so the level of serotonin produced within the brain of the mice can be determined by genetics. Some mice will have higher levels of serotonin than others. Mice with higher levels of serotonin are generally more peaceful, less aggressive. Mice with lower levels of serotonin through their genetics will have an elevated level of aggression. Okay, so that is a behavioral trait that is determined by genetics as well. Same can be said with people. Some people are just angrier than other people because maybe they have a higher level of serotonin, etc., etc. Okay. Developmental bacterial immunity can also be an exhibit or a characteristic that is determined by genetics and can be considered as a trait. Here are two, you can sort of see antibiotics on a petri dish, and you can see that this one here is much more effective on this particular bacterial colony than this one here. You can see this one is not as immune, and so they don't come anywhere close to the antibiotic, whereas this one does. And so you can see there, that is also another trait that is a phenotype with a genetic basis. Okay. The environment plays a really important role. So the phenotype of an organism isn't only affected by the genotype, but also the environment it's in, right? So we generally use the formula, the phenotype is both the combination of the genotype and the effect of the environment. Now, what do I mean by environment in this case? The environment can be anything external to the organism. It doesn't have to be where the organism lives. It's what it is exposed to that also it contributes to some of these traits, okay? If you have the MC1R gene, it means you have a code for freckles, yeah, which means you are more likely to produce freckles, and you're more likely to produce lots of freckles when you have this particular gene. However, freckles are extremely affected by UV exposure. So individuals who have MC1R gene but don't go out in the sunlight will not develop freckles. And so this particular gene here, the phenotype being freckles and the genotype being MC1R and all of its allele variations, are determined by both the genetics and the environment, in this particular case, UV exposure in sunlight. Yeah? And so if you have the genes for freckles and you don't go out in the sun that much, then you are very less, you're unlikely to develop freckles. Right? Identical twins and fingerprints, you can sort of see that identical twins will generally have the same kind of fingerprints or similar-ish fingerprints, but they're never exactly the same. Yeah, so similar patterns, but never the same, despite the fact that they have exact same genetics. And so you can see there, fingerprints are also affected by the environment that it grows up in, characteristics, changes in nutrient levels, etc., etc. And so the environment plays a role there as well, because they have the same genetics, but these genetics are being affected by the environment that the individuals live in, right? And so genotypes and phenotypes are connected through that. Yeah, this is the key point that you need to be able to understand, that environment plays just as important of a role as the genes do, okay? Let me go through a particular example. Let's look at PKU and diet. Now, PKU is an example which is a really good example because it kind of shows really well how, as people, when we understand underlying genetic disorders, we can actually manage them better, and they don't have to have the devastating effect that they generally sometimes have on individuals. Okay, so PKU stands for phenylketonuria. It's a genetic disorder where the enzyme PHE hydroxylase is not produced. Yeah. Now, the PKU is the gene that produces the enzyme hydroxylase. Okay. The hydroxylase breaks down a particular amino acid called phenylalanine, PHE. Yeah. So if you have this PKU gene, the you produce this enzyme. The enzyme is able to then break down this particular amino acid, phenylalanine, right? If you don't have it, or if you have a mutated PKU gene, the enzyme doesn't work. If the enzyme doesn't work, it means you can't break down phenylalanine and it builds up in your body, okay? Your body isn't able to remove it, okay? And so individuals with a homozygous recessive genotype lowercase p, remember, homozygous meaning they're the same, recessive means they're both lowercase p, right? It means that the individual cannot break down phenylalanine and it builds up in the body, particularly in the brain. Now, this has a few things: brain damage, mental retardation, and the like, okay? Just because you have lowercase p does not mean you're doomed to suffer from PKU. PKU is the phenylketonuria condition in which there is an overbuildup and it results in damages to the brain, okay? If you can regulate your diet and take phenylalanine out of the diet, then you can reduce the effect of the environment, if that makes sense, okay? You can control that particular condition simply by understanding the genetic the genetic causes and then managing some of those symptoms that are there. So if an individual with a PP lowercase genotype and have a high PHE or phenylalanine diet, it results in PKU. If they have a low, they will have a normal phenotype. Yeah, they won't develop PKU. And so you can see there that there is a whole set of PKU-friendly diets that individuals can have, and if you can, the earlier you find it and the more you manage it, the more you are able to reduce the effect it has on the brain. Right? So early diagnosis is really critical because the sooner the condition is identified, the easier it is to control and to minimize its effects. Okay. All right, we're going to stop it then. Next video, we're going to look at polygenic inheritance, but I'll catch you guys then. All right, see ya.